Richard Hensley walked into his late father's kitchen 3 mornings after burying him, intending to start sorting through decades of accumulated belongings, and found his father's 1953 Hamilton pocket watch sitting squarely in the center of the table, the same watch the family had personally placed inside Walter Hensley's casket before it was lowered into the ground 72 hours earlier. Walter Hensley died at 91, a retired railway engineer whose pocket watch, a gift from his own late wife on their 5th wedding anniversary, had become the family's most sentimentally significant heirloom, one Walter had explicitly requested in writing to be buried with him. Richard's initial thought was that the grave had been disturbed, a possibility that sent him calling the cemetery's caretaker within minutes, badly shaken by the idea that his father's resting place might have been violated for something as seemingly minor as an old watch. The caretaker inspected the gravesite that same afternoon and found no evidence of disturbance whatsoever. The ground remained undisturbed, exactly as it had been left after burial, ruling out theft or vandalism as an explanation for the watch's reappearance. While Richard searched for answers, the extended family gathered, uneasy and confused, in Walter's living room. All of them except one branch, Walter's daughter Carol and her own daughter Emily, 26, who hadn't been invited to the funeral at all. A continuation of an estrangement that had lasted 22 years. Carol had been effectively cut off from the Hensley family at 24 after marrying a man Walter's late wife, Eleanor, considered beneath the family's standing, a rift Walter never publicly opposed at the time, choosing family harmony with his other children over defending his daughter's marriage, a decision he privately regretted for decades without ever fully reversing it. Unbeknownst to the rest of the family, Walter had quietly re-established contact with Emily 3 years earlier, after she reached out following a mutual friend's suggestion, beginning a private relationship built on weekly visits and eventually regular presence throughout Walter's final months of declining health. During his final week in hospice care, Walter asked Emily to do something unusual, accept his actual pocket watch as a private gift, while he arranged, through the funeral home, for a nearly identical replacement watch to be placed in the casket for the family's public farewell. Walter explained his reasoning to Emily in a letter he asked her to keep sealed until she felt ready to share it. He feared that announcing the gift publicly before his death would reignite old family conflict during his final days, something he no longer had the strength to referee. And he trusted Emily to decide on her own timeline when to reveal what he'd actually done. Funeral director Thomas Reyes later confirmed the substitution had been made with Walter's full, documented consent weeks before his death, a private and entirely legal arrangement between a man and his own possessions, regardless of how unusual the family would eventually find its execution. Emily attended the funeral from a distance, sitting in her car in the cemetery parking lot rather than approaching the gathered family, unable to bring herself to reveal what she was holding, while grief and decades of exclusion sat so visibly unresolved in front of her. 3 days later, using a spare key Walter had given her during their private visits, Emily let herself into his house, while she knew the family would be gathered elsewhere, placing the watch on the kitchen table alongside Walter's sealed letter, unable to face the family directly, but unwilling to keep the gift a permanent secret either. Walter's letter, read aloud by Richard to the assembled family that evening, admitted plainly, "I let pride keep Carol away from this family for 22 years, and I don't have time left to fix that the slow way. Emily has been the only one of you who actually showed up for me these last 3 years. This watch belongs with her, and so, I hope, does the rest of you." Time seemed to stand still in Walter's living room as the family absorbed both the confession and the accusation embedded quietly inside it, that their own collective coldness toward Carol's branch had continued a rift Walter himself had started, and evidently come to regret deeply by the end. Richard, now the family's eldest surviving sibling, initially bristled at the letter's implication, defending decades of family decisions as reasonable responses to Carol's own choices, rather than acknowledging the family's role in sustaining the estrangement long after any original justification had faded. Richard's wife, who'd stayed largely quiet through the family's public loyalty to the rift over the years, told him privately that night that Walter's final act had been, in her words, the bravest thing he ever did, and it took him 91 years to manage it. Please don't take another 20 before you catch up. Richard called Carol directly 4 days later, a conversation neither of them had attempted in over 2 decades, opening not with an apology exactly, but with an invitation to Walter's delayed family memorial gathering the following month. A family therapist the Hensleys consulted during their reconciliation process cited research indicating that roughly 27% of American adults report being estranged from at least one family member, with reconciliation, when it occurs, most often triggered by a death, illness, or major life event rather than a resolved underlying conflict, a pattern the family recognized uncomfortably clearly in their own timeline. The family ultimately decided together that the watch should stay with Emily permanently, honoring both Walter's explicit final wish and, symbolically, the 22 years of connection the rest of the family had missed the chance to build with her themselves. Carol attended her first Hensley family holiday gathering in 22 years that December, an event Richard described afterward as quieter and more awkward than I expected, and also somehow the best 2 hours our family has spent together in longer than I can remember. The Hensley family spent 3 frightened days believing something impossible had happened to their father's grave, when the truth was both simpler and harder to sit with. An old man had spent his final months quietly trying to fix, in the only way he had strength left for, a wound his own choices had helped create decades earlier. The lesson isn't that grief reveals hidden magic in the world. It's that the people we love sometimes save their most honest corrections for the very end, when there's no more time left to manage the fallout carefully. And the families lucky enough to receive those corrections still have to decide, deliberately and without any more excuses, whether they're finally ready to act on them.